The morning light struggled to penetrate the layer of grime covering the dirty windows of Grace Monroe's cramped apartment in Queens, finally managing to slice through the lingering gloom. The thin, golden ribbons made the single, box-like room appear softer, momentarily kinder than the harsh reality it held. At 29, Grace had long ago dispensed with the necessity of an alarm clock. When life consistently demanded more than it ever returned, you learned to rise with the faint suggestion of dawn. You learned to keep moving, propelled by necessity, whether your reserves of strength were tapped out or not. Rent payments, back-to-back shifts, the slow, silent murder of dreams, and grief, the kind that doesn't shatter you in one spectacular explosion, but quietly, painstakingly reshapes you until the girl you once were is unrecognizable. These were her drivers. She sat up slowly, her brown hair falling across her shoulders in tired waves, and reached for the worn phone resting atop a stack of faded culinary textbooks she'd bought secondhand. They were a monument to a deferred future, from the time when she still held the fierce, youthful belief that she could become a chef. 5:47 a.m. 13 minutes early. 13 minutes she could have spent sinking back into sleep, or remembering, or perhaps achieving the temporary mercy of forgetting. Instead, she whispered the same 2 words she'd spoken every morning since her mother died 5 years prior. Another day. It wasn't a lament, nor was it a statement of hope. It was simply a declaration of survival. The apartment was barely 300 square feet, a well-worn cage, but Grace had infused it with what little warmth she possessed. One wall was papered in old Polaroids, fragments of a universe that had since imploded. Her mother, radiant and slightly tipsy, smiling at her high school graduation. Her little brother, Liam, cheeks puffed out as he struggled to blow out the candles on a lopsided birthday cake, frosted far too thickly. These were snapshots from a world that no longer existed. Liam had been 13, just a kid, when he was caught in crossfire meant for someone else 5 years ago. The memory wasn't just painful. It was a jagged shard of glass eternally embedded in her chest. Wrong street, wrong time, a randomness that mocked the very notion of fairness. Grace didn't look at the photos for too long. Grief had a malignant way of setting fires inside you, and the best defense was to starve it of oxygen. She dressed with the economy and precision of muscle memory. Cheap black polyester work slacks, a crisp, starched white button-up, and black sneakers whose soles were worn thin from too many miles walked for too little compensation. The mirror reflected a woman who looked far older than 29. Lines etched around her eyes, worry mapped onto every detail of her posture. Yet, her eyes still held something salvageable. A deep current of kindness, perhaps even a muted warmth, hidden beneath the exhaustion. At 7:23 a.m., Grace stepped off the elevated subway platform into the bone-cutting chill of a New York November. The city roared around her. Delivery trucks rumbling past like mechanical beasts, food carts steaming with thin plumes of white smoke, and the distant, mournful wail of sirens. She pulled her thin coat tighter across her chest. She had meant to invest in a warmer one last winter, but dreams and sensible winter clothing had to wait when the rent demanded payment first. 3 blocks later, she arrived at Romano's Italian Kitchen, a family-run staple tucked deep into the heart of Little Italy. The place smelled like comfort, a rich, enveloping combination of aged wood, slow-simmered garlic, basil, and fresh yeast, and looked like it hadn't entertained the idea of change in 4 decades. To Grace, Romano's felt like the closest thing she had left to an anchor. Morning Gracie called Tony Romano, 63 years old, yet still sweeping the sidewalk with the manic energy of a man half his age. "Morning, Tony," she replied, offering a tired but utterly genuine smile. Inside, the warm, complex scent of the kitchen wrapped around her like a physical hug. Maria Romano, Tony's wife, was already entrenched in her domain, her apron dusted white with flour, a heavy wooden spoon in hand. "Taste this," she said in her warm, thick Italian accent, holding out a simmering spoonful of ruby-red tomato sauce. And just like that, for 2 brief, precious hours, Grace wasn't merely a struggling, grief-haunted waitress. She was a daughter again, a student, a dreamer, absorbing the language of food and the vocabulary of unconditional love. For these 2 hours, the ache in her bones and the yawning hole in her bank account ceased to exist. She chopped, stirred, listened, and learned. Then, at exactly 11:15 a.m., as the lunchtime crowd began to surge, the subtle shift began. Everything was about to change. Grace didn't yet know about the little girl who was moments away from walking through Romano's front door, or the armed men who were stalking her. She didn't know that before the clock struck 2, Grace Monroe, quiet, invisible, almost forgotten, would make a single, instinctive, and irreversible decision. A decision that would tear her from the safe harbor of obscurity and drag her into a hidden world of immense power, terrifying danger, and unforgiving secrets, forever bonding her to a child she'd only just met, ultimately costing her blood and rewriting the entire, quiet story of her life. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches upon something quiet and unspoken inside you, if you recognize the weight of sacrifice and the unexpected call to courage, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing you heartfelt stories of human resilience every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from and leave a comment below. We treasure every piece of connection you share with us, knowing which corner of the world this story has reached. Grace was meticulously wiping down the old wooden counter at Romano's when the bell over the door chimed, drawing her gaze up. A woman walked in first, her stride steady and calibrated, belonging to someone who had endured years of specialized training. Beside her was a little girl, certainly no older than 6, a study in fragile elegance. The child wore a tailored cream coat and a pale pink cashmere scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, her small hands clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hops. Grace's attention immediately settled on the girl's eyes. Large, round, and bright, yet carrying an unsettling sorrow far older than childhood itself. The woman settled at the window table, her gaze sweeping the room with quick, professional precision, assessing every detail before she offered Grace a curt, soft nod. The girl climbed onto the seat across from her guardian and placed Mr. Hops on the table like a silent companion. Grace approached with her small notebook and pen, offering a gentle, practiced smile. "Hello, sweetheart. What would you like to order today?" The girl glanced toward the woman for permission. The woman nodded once. The girl looked up at Grace, and her voice was light and clear, like distant wind chimes. "Spaghetti, but only with butter, no tomato sauce, no cheese, and water with no ice." Grace smiled, recognizing the strict ritual of a child accustomed to specific demands. "A wonderful choice. Will you and your rabbit be having the same thing?" The little girl nodded solemnly and hugged Mr. Hops even tighter. As Grace walked away, she felt the woman's eyes tracking her. Not mistrusting her, precisely, but meticulously assessing her. A gaze that was silent and carefully analytical. In the kitchen, Maria was kneading a large mound of dough, peering out with open curiosity. "New customers?" she asked. A little girl with a sadness older than her age, Grace murmured, watching them. "And the woman with her. She does not seem like a mother, but someone fiercely protective, like a shield cut from granite." Maria nodded, her understanding requiring no further explanation. Grace returned moments later with a plate of warm, buttered pasta and placed it gently before the girl. "Thank you," the girl whispered, setting Mr. Hops beside the plate. She began eating slowly and politely, with an unnerving perfection, as though she had been trained to behave flawlessly under every circumstance. After a few minutes, Grace noticed she had taken her own small pencil from her pocket and was drawing on a napkin. She was sketching a fortress-like castle with sharply pointed towers and a sky full of meticulously drawn stars. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity, Grace leaned closer. "What are you drawing?" The girl looked up, her eyes still clouded with their heavy sorrow, yet glimmering faintly with a hidden thought. "My castle, but it only exists in my head." Grace sat across from her, tilting her head slightly. "Why only in your head?" "Because my house is not like a castle. It just has a lot of silence." The words, spoken with utter simplicity, cut through Grace's composure like a small, unexpected blade. She said nothing, only nodded, her eyes softened by recognition. She understood silence, the heavy, echoing silence that settles in a place that once held laughter and now only holds memory. The woman, Elena, rose from her seat and approached the child with a step so quiet it seemed to absorb all sound. She placed a proprietary hand on the child's shoulder. "We have to go." The girl nodded dutifully, slipping her drawing into the pocket of her coat and hugging Mr. Hops to her chest. Before leaving, she turned back to Grace and whispered a brittle, high compliment. "You make the best pasta I have ever eaten." Then she vanished through the door, leaving behind a strange, lingering emptiness in the air. Grace stood motionless, gazing through the window, feeling something inside her crack and tighten all at once. She couldn't rationalize the feeling, but she knew with grim certainty that she would see the girl again, and next time, the encounter would not be this peaceful. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. Sophia's small silhouette was still etched in her thoughts, along with that whisper of a sentence drifting through her heart like a passing, tragic breeze. "My house just has a lot of silence." Grace had never heard a 6-year-old articulate such a profound sense of isolation. It was not a complaint, but a fracture revealing the desolate landscape of her inner world. When she returned to clear the table, Grace looked carefully at the napkin the girl had abandoned. On it was the half-finished drawing. The castle had tall, pointed roofs, a wide wooden gate, and rows of trees lining the path. But in the very center, where windows or the warm yellow glow of welcoming lights should have been, there was only a dark, heavily shaded void, a fortress built against light. Grace folded the napkin gently and slipped it into her pocket, unsure why, but feeling an undeniable, almost protective need to keep it. Her eyes drifted toward the corner where the two had sat. When Sophia spoke to her, Elena had always positioned herself at a careful angle, her eyes never leaving the doorway. Even while the girl ate or drew, Elena remained hyper-alert. Grace realized she was not merely a companion or escort. She moved and held herself like a professional bodyguard, or someone who had been forced to live too long in a state of terminal vigilance. Her manner was devoid of wasted gestures, free of any false smiles. A chilling wall of ice watching every shadow and fluctuation in the room. Outside Romano's, the sky had turned a flat, heavy gray. Snowflakes drifted down, tapping against the window like the quiet, approaching rhythm of a major change. Tony Romano stepped in from the storage room, holding a freshly bundled handful of oregano. He stared at Grace for a moment, lifting a skeptical brow. "That kid." Her eyes looked like she has seen things she should not have seen. Grace nodded slowly, her intuition validated. "And the woman with her, did you notice how she kept watching the exits?" Tony set the fragrant herbs on the counter and hesitated before speaking softly, his voice low with old-world understanding. "The way she stood, the way she scanned the room, the way she sat with her back against the wall. That is someone who has lived in dangerous places. Gracie. Someone who knows how to fight for the next breath." A chill, stark and immediate, ran down Grace's spine. It was partly because of the visceral horror she had witnessed when Liam died, and partly because her instinct, sharpened by nearly a decade of grinding poverty and irrevocable loss, was shouting. When danger is truly near, it does not first speak to the rational mind. It speaks directly to intuition, and her intuition was screaming that those two were not simply customers seeking a quiet lunch. Later that afternoon, with the restaurant bustling and loudly crowded, Grace kept glancing toward the empty table where Sophia had sat, as though hoping to see the small figure reappear or find some leftover clue. But aside from the folded napkin in her pocket, nothing remained. After her shift, seated in the small, dim break room behind the kitchen, Grace pulled the napkin out again. She smoothed it flat, her fingers tracing the faint, fragile pencil marks. This castle had no people, no light, no open windows. It resembled a lonely fortress more than a place designed for dreaming. And again, she heard Sophia's soft, small voice echoing in her mind so clearly it was as though the child was whispering right beside her. "My house is not like a castle. It just has a lot of silence." Grace clenched the paper, feeling she had stumbled upon something incredibly fragile and important, a secret hidden in plain sight. She did not know why, but she was certain the girl's story held more shadows than anyone could see, and somehow she sensed she would be drawn into it sooner than she imagined. That afternoon, Romano's hummed with its usual midday chaos. The rhythmic clatter of dishes, the loud, overlapping voices of hungry customers, the rich scent of tomato sauce and warm bread drifting through the room. Grace was carrying a heavy tray of food when the bell over the door rang again, an ordinary sound that nonetheless made her head turn instantly. 3 men walked in. They were not tourists nor office workers grabbing a quick, forgettable lunch. They carried something heavier, darker, an aura of menace that was immediately palpable. Their eyes swept the room like cold blades, searching not for an empty table, but for a target. One positioned himself by the entrance. Another moved swiftly toward the back service area, and the third walked slowly between the crowded tables, one hand deliberately hidden beneath his thick wool coat. The instantaneous rise of tension in the air struck Grace before she had time to form a conscious thought, and her survival instincts, honed by past trauma, flared terrifyingly awake. She scanned the room, desperately searching for whoever was in the greatest danger, and then she saw Sophia. The girl had returned to Romano's and sat at the same window table she had occupied that morning. Elena stood rigidly beside her, her attention fully focused on the newcomers. It was clear Elena had noticed the men, too. Her hand moved to her expensive shoulder bag, a finger brushing the zipper pull. No one spoke a single word. Yet the sudden silence that fell over their corner of the restaurant was infinitely more terrifying than any scream. One of the men looked directly at Sophia, and in that frozen instant, Grace understood everything. They were not here to eat. They were here for the child. Elena drew her gun with such blinding speed that many customers did not even register the motion. Shouts erupted as instant panic swept the room. Chairs crashing, glassware shattering, people scrambling frantically for any available cover. Tony shouted for everyone to get down, but his desperate voice was swallowed by the chaos. Grace did not think. She did not analyze the odds. She did not hesitate. Her body moved entirely on its own, driven by the primal, desperate instinct of someone who had already lost too much. She ran toward Sophia with a speed born of terror and memory. Gunfire cracked through the dense air, sharp and violently merciless. One shot, then another, the same hateful final sound she remembered from the most painful moment of her life. Elena returned fire, kicking over a large table to provide a sliver of cover for Sophia. But the closest attacker had already raised his weapon, aiming specifically at the child's small figure. Grace reached them before her mind could catch up to her catastrophic action. She dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around Sophia, pulled the girl tightly against her chest, and deliberately turned her back toward the muzzle of the gun. Only one thought burned through the consuming fear. Not again. No other child will die like Liam. The first bullet tore through her left shoulder, a white-hot, searing pain that stole her breath and ripped a ragged sound from her throat. But she held Sophia tighter, cementing her own body as an agonizing, breathing shield. The second bullet slammed into her ribs, sending a staggering wave of burning heat through her side. Sophia cried out, a choked, terrified sound, gripping Grace so fiercely that her small nails dug into her skin. Elena continued shooting, pushing the attackers back inch by inch, her eyes never once leaving Sophia or Grace. Smoke, screams, splintered wood, and the raw sobs of panicked customers merged into a violent, overwhelming storm. But at the center of the devastation, Grace felt only the trembling, desperate heartbeat pressed against her own chest. She forced Sophia to the floor, whispering through shattered breaths, "It is all right. I am here." Warm, sticky blood seeped through Grace's white shirt, spreading quickly and soaking into Sophia's small hands. The girl sobbed, her voice shaking with terror. "Grace, you are hurt. Do not leave me." Everything blurred around Grace. The gunfire ceased, replaced by heavy, pounding footsteps and the loud slam of a retreating door. Elena dropped down beside them, checking Grace's wounds with swift, urgent movements. The woman's face, usually cold and impenetrable as steel, had turned a shocking pale gray. "Do not fall asleep, Grace. You saved her. You have to stay awake." Grace heard Elena calling for help, heard the customers crying, heard Tony's frantic, desperate voice. But the sounds drifted farther and farther away, as if submerged deep underwater. The only thing anchoring her to the spinning world was the small, tenacious hand clutching her own, warm and trembling with fear and a fierce, clinging hope. The girl called her name again and again, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Do not go. Please do not go." Grace tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by exhaustion and loss of blood. She desperately wanted to say everything would be all right, that she would not leave her, but only a faint, shallow breath escaped her lips. Before darkness finally swept over her, the last thing she saw was Sophia's tear-streaked face, her eyes filled with terror and a pleading, protective love. And in that moment, Grace understood her life had violently veered onto a path from which there would be no safe, quiet return. Blood streaked across the worn tile floor of Romano's, dark and thick, like a physical manifestation of Grace's life refusing to part from her body. She lay motionless, her head tilted to one side, her hair matted against the wound that was soaking through her shoulder. Sophia knelt beside her, heedless of the surrounding chaos. The child's small hand was pressed desperately against Grace's chest, as if she could manually hold the woman's fluttering heartbeat in place. The same woman who only hours earlier had smiled and handed her a warm plate of buttered pasta. "Please do not die." Sophia's voice cracked, already hoarse from crying. She shook Grace's shoulder gently, but the body only stirred faintly before going completely limp again. Tears streamed down Sophia's cheeks, falling fast and mingling with the blood below. Elena crouched beside them, one hand gripping a secure, specialized phone tight to her ear. Her gaze never left the pair on the floor. Her voice was low and precise, carrying the absolute clarity of command. "Call the private doctor. Mobilize the private ambulance. Location Romano's, Little Italy. Emergency level critical. Child present." A moment later, she pulled a second phone from an inner coat pocket. A small, black device with no visible logos and only a single, silent button. She pressed it and waited. After exactly 3 rings, a man's deep, controlled voice answered. "Speak." Elena did not hesitate, providing only the essential details. "A woman." She shielded Sophia. "She took 2 bullets. She is unconscious. I am keeping her alive until your team arrives." A long, heavy silence fell on the other end of the line. Then the man's voice returned, subtly altered, weighted now with something harsher than his usual chilling detachment. "Her name, Grace Monroe." Silence again, heavier this time, pregnant with unspoken history. And then only a single absolute command, delivered with terrible authority. "Keep her alive at any cost." Elena ended the call and knelt fully beside Grace. Sophia was still sobbing uncontrollably, her face blotched red, her small hands sticky with Grace's blood. Elena swiftly pressed her coat against the wound along Grace's ribs, applying hard pressure to staunch the bleeding. She reached into her pocket for a specialized hemostatic bandage, the kind reserved only for the gravest field emergencies, and secured it over the wound in Grace's shoulder. Blood soaked instantly through the fabric and onto Elena's hands, hot and metallic, but she did not blink or tremble. She knew she was holding life itself for the woman who had thrown her own body over the child who mattered more than anything in their world. In the distance, sirens sounded, but not the screeching, erratic wail of public ambulances. This was a low, controlled engine, fast and quiet. A black, unmarked SUV slipped stealthily into the alley behind Romano's, and 2 men in dark, expensive suits stepped out, carrying a medical case built for emergency field surgery. They did not need to ask questions. Elena spoke only 2 words. "Grace Monroe." One man knelt, checked the pulse, then nodded grimly to the second. "There is a chance." They lifted Grace onto the stretcher with surprising gentleness, using practiced movements. Sophia clung fiercely to Grace's hand, screaming, "I am going with her. She cannot go without me. Elena nodded, her resolution firm. Go. No one will take you from her. The child was carefully carried into the specialized vehicle, still clutching Mr. Hops, her hands smeared darkly with Grace's blood. As the SUV sped silently through the back streets, Elena stood alone in the wreckage. Romano's was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. Customers had been evacuated. Maria sat stunned on the kitchen floor while Tony Romano stood shaking, futilely wiping Grace's blood from the tiles with a cheap paper napkin. Elena lifted her eyes toward the gray afternoon sky, the wind cutting sharply against the collar of her suit. She knew she had called a man who hated any disturbance to his control. But today was profoundly different. Today, a stranger, a civilian named Grace Monroe, had taken bullets for Sophia Moretti, a woman with absolutely no connection to their violent, hidden world. And that changes everything. Days bled into nights in a haze of antiseptic and hushed, sterile voices before Grace finally surfaced from the consuming darkness. The pain was no longer sharp, but a dull, heavy anchor dragging her down toward the mattress. The first light she sensed was not sunlight, but the soft, diffused glow of recessed lamps filtered through heavy, milky curtains. The air smelled clinically of antiseptic and expensive, clean linen. She tried to move, but her body felt impossibly heavy, anchored beneath layers of blankets and dull, throbbing pain. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting a high ceiling intricately carved with complex molding. Nothing like any public hospital she had ever seen. The room was unnaturally quiet. No distant footsteps, no alarms, only the faint, steady hush of her own heartbeat monitored by unseen machines. She turned her head, a small movement that drew a faint groan from her throat. The heavy door opened silently. A man stepped inside, tall and effortlessly composed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, a black coat draped over his arm. His hair was neatly trimmed and severe, but it was his eyes that instantly struck her, sharp as polished blades, yet carrying a worn, terrible exhaustion. Exhaustion. He stood still for a moment, his broad silhouette blocking the doorway light, before speaking softly, the sound of his voice rich and low. Thank you for saving my daughter. Grace blinked, her mind slow to process the words, still struggling to anchor itself in reality. Your daughter? She repeated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He nodded, his expression unreadable, though his voice remained deep and steady. Sophia is the child you shielded. I am Nathaniel Moretti. I believe Elena told you a little. Grace tried to push herself up, intending to sit, but a searing, agonizing pain tore through her left shoulder and ribs, forcing a sharp inhalation that made her tense instantly. He moved closer immediately, not making physical contact, but bracing his hand firmly on the polished wood of the bed rail, ready to steady her if she faltered. You should rest. You lost a significant amount of blood. The doctor insisted on complete stillness. Grace shifted her gaze around the massive room, walnut furniture polished to a deep sheen, white silk drapes drawn across the large windows, and a crystalline vase holding a spray of luminous orchids glowing beside a window that overlooked a meticulously manicured, lush garden. This was no ordinary hospital, she managed, her throat dry. She swallowed hard. Where exactly am I? Nate answered without the slightest flicker of hesitation, his eyes meeting hers directly. My family's private medical facility just outside Manhattan. We wanted to ensure you received the absolute best care available. Grace exhaled slowly, closing her eyes briefly, forcing her racing pulse to calm. I do not have insurance. The statement was blunt, a raw confession of her reality. His head tilted, a faint smile appearing at the edge of his lips. It was a practiced expression, not quite warm enough to be comforting, but certainly not unkind. That is not a concern. Everything is taken care of, and I am not here to negotiate gratitude. I am here to make a proposal. Grace opened her eyes, focusing intently on the stranger whose powerful, dangerous life had irrevocably collided with hers through the violent, singular event of blood and gunfire. What kind of proposal? Nate lowered himself gracefully into an upholstered chair positioned beside her bed, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both professional and intensely personal. Sophia is in shock. She has not spoken much since the attack, but she keeps asking for you. She feels safe with you. He paused, choosing his words with surgical precision. I want to invite you to stay at my home while you recover. Not as a guest, he clarified immediately, anticipating her objection. As someone who can be near Sophia, you would have private medical support, staff, your own room, and I will ensure you lack absolutely nothing. Grace stared at him, unable to process the sheer audacity and scale of what she was hearing. You want me to live with your family just because Sophia wants it? Nate held her gaze, his own unwavering. No. I want Sophia to have someone she trusts, someone who can help her heal. I cannot give her that in this state, but you can. You threw yourself over her without a moment's hesitation. That act means more to me than any oath of loyalty or contract I could write. Grace was speechless. A potent cocktail of pain, confusion, and a quiet, trembling emotion she hadn't felt in years. A sense of value rose within her chest. She was not someone who trusted easily, nor was she accustomed to receiving kindness without a heavy, hidden price tag. But Sophia's eyes, the child's choked, terrified scream as she lay bleeding in Grace's arms, still echoed inside her memory. Grace nodded faintly, a decision made on instinct alone, as though she herself could hardly believe the words leaving her lips. I need a few days to recover and to understand what exactly is happening. But if it helps the child, I will come. Nate nodded, his expression softening just slightly, the smallest acknowledgement of relief. Thank you, Grace Monroe. He rose and stepped out of the room, leaving her alone with the slowing, uneven rhythm of her own heartbeat. And in that abrupt quiet, she understood one profound truth with chilling clarity. This was not merely kindness from a grateful father. This was the beginning of something larger, infinitely more complicated, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. The black SUV rolled silently, almost stealthily, along a long, winding gravel path leading toward the heart of the Moretti estate, just as the last pale thread of the sun dipped behind the dense growth of the pines. Grace sat rigid in the back seat, clutching a small, worn canvas bag containing only a few clean clothes, an old notebook, and the folded napkin with Sophia's original crayon-drawn castle. She still was not entirely certain of her decision, only its inevitability. The transition was vertiginous. From a cramped 300-square-foot room above a noisy bakery in Queens to a sprawling, fortress-like estate guarded by silent men in tailored black suits, scattered like immovable chess pieces across the landscape. She felt as if she had stepped without warning into a story that was never meant for someone like her. Yet deep in her chest, she knew she had come because of Sophia's insistent, wounded eyes, because of the child's sobbing voice when blood soaked through Grace's thin shirt, because of a powerful, immediate bond she could not, and perhaps did not want to, explain. The vehicle stopped before a small house set distinctly apart from the imposing main mansion. It was a charming red brick cottage with a sloping roof and pale purple bougainvillea spilling gracefully over the porch railings. The door opened immediately, releasing a warm amber light onto the stone path. Elena waited outside, her posture composed as always, yet her usual neutrality was softened by something almost imperceptible, a hint of quiet relief. She nodded for Grace to enter, her voice low. This is the guest house. You will stay here, close to the main home, but with complete privacy. There is a private doctor, staff, and dedicated security assigned only to this house. If you want quiet, you will have quiet. Grace stepped inside, her palms damp with nervous sweat. The interior was elegant, certainly, but it felt warm and lived in, not ostentatious. A deeply cushioned armchair sat invitingly beside a large window. A stone fireplace glowed softly with banked embers, and the bookshelves held a mix of worn fairy tales, classic novels, and well-used cookbooks. In the corner stood an old upright piano with ivory keys faded gently by time. Grace exhaled quietly, allowing herself a brief moment to believe this refuge was real. She had barely set her bag down beside the door when the sound of small, frantic footsteps pattered loudly up the wooden porch. The door swung open and Sophia rushed in like a burst of pent-up wind, throwing her small, fragile arms around Grace's waist with a force that momentarily startled her. "Grace, you really came." The girl looked up, her large brown eyes shimmering not with fear, but with unconcealed tears of joy. She still clutched Mr. Hops, the stuffed rabbit, one frayed, well-loved ear dangling precariously. Grace bent down slowly, hugging her tightly despite the sharp, lingering ache in her shoulder, her guarded heart softening in ways she had not thought possible since she was a child herself. Sophia pulled back, reaching behind her for a folded piece of paper she'd hidden. She unfolded it carefully, reverently, and held it out with both hands. "I drew this yesterday. It is for you." The picture showed two figures standing together in a field of oddly purple flowers. One figure was tall with brown hair, the other small, clutching Mr. Hops. Above them, written in uneven but earnest letters, were the words, "Grace and Sophia, best friends forever." Grace's heart clenched fiercely, not from physical pain, but from the sudden overwhelming emergence of something fragile and beautiful, something she had long ago convinced herself she no longer deserved to feel. She sat down in the armchair and lifted Sophia onto her lap, her hand brushing gently through the child's soft, fine hair. "You draw beautifully, Sophia. I will keep this forever." Sophia nodded happily and rested her head on Grace's shoulder, her small, trusting body melting entirely into the older woman's embrace. In that moment, suspended within the warm amber glow of the unfamiliar house, Grace no longer thought of bullets or blood or the inescapable shadows of her past. She only knew, with pure clarity, that she was profoundly needed. Not merely as a server in a greasy diner, not as a weary survivor struggling through each passing day, but as something far greater, someone to trust, a safe place to return to. And for Sophia, perhaps Grace had just become the first true, unconditional home the child had ever known. Grace woke just as a pale, hesitant thread of sunlight slipped through the thick canopy of the surrounding oak trees. It had been 2 weeks since the shooting, yet sitting up in bed still required a calculated, agonizing effort against the sharp, persistent protest of her healing ribs. She moved with practiced slowness, her left arm immobilized in a heavy sling, her breath deliberately shallow to avoid pulling at the angry, healing stitches. The doctor had ordered strict bed rest, but Grace had never been good at staying still, or following rules that felt arbitrary. She managed to brew a cup of strong tea with one hand, her fingers trembling slightly with the effort, and shuffled onto the porch, her eyes immediately drifting toward the looming shape of the main estate. The house was not merely large. It was a fortress, fortified with a chilling vigilance that reminded her of a modern-day citadel. Guards in tailored black suits patrolled in rotating, silent pairs. High-definition cameras sat mounted discreetly on every corner, following unseen protocols, and behind the large glass rose conservatory stood a small, unobtrusive watchtower. The wrought iron gate was immensely tall and deceptively heavy, manned consistently by 2 rigid guards who inspected every single vehicle coming and going with slow, meticulous precision. Every movement followed a rigid protocol. Every person knew their precise role, and no one deviated from the silent, underlying command structure imposed by Nathaniel Moretti's world. Grace had heard whispers about the Moretti name and their extensive reputation. But witnessing such an intense, extensive security system unnerved her in a way she hadn't expected. This was not only a display of insurmountable wealth, it was preparedness bordering on clinical paranoia, a sure sign of lives lived with serious danger never more than a single step away. And she was now, inexplicably, in the very center of it all. Yet behind all those cold layers of steel, high walls, and silence was Sophia. Sophia remained a 6-year-old child with an unfiltered curiosity, endless streams of questions, and a heart now more attached to Grace than the older woman had ever anticipated. In a matter of days, the two of them had settled into their own quiet rhythm. Reading together curled up on the window seat in the afternoons, making slightly burnt pancakes on quiet Sunday mornings, often covering the kitchen in flour and spontaneous, brief laughter, then curling beneath blankets at night as Grace read fairy tales into the soft, comforting glow of a bedside lamp. Sophia did not laugh often, but when she did, The sound felt like the sun breaking brilliantly through a world made entirely of deep, oppressive shadows. One afternoon, as they colored intently together in the cottage living room, Sophia spoke suddenly, without looking up from her task, her voice thin and small, as though speaking of something not entirely her own. "Grace, my mother died in a car accident." Grace paused her own coloring and looked down at the child diligently filling in the roof of a castle with a bright red crayon. "Do you miss her?" Sophia nodded slowly, her lips pressed tight in concentration. "I missed the smell of her hair." She smiled a lot, but she also looked far away sometimes, like she was listening to something no one else could hear, always just beyond the window. Grace rested her good hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "Does your father talk about her much?" The question brought a long, absolute silence. Sophia set her crayon down carefully, leaned back against the cushion of her chair, and her eyes dimmed, as though an internal door had been slammed shut violently by the wind. "He only says the car lost control, that no one did anything wrong. It was just unlucky." In the child's eyes, Grace recognized a quiet, familiar flicker of doubt, the kind of unnerving uncertainty children instinctively sense but cannot yet articulate. The distinct shape of truths intentionally left untold. She wrapped her arms around Sophia, her embrace soft and immediately protective, as if sheltering the child from the emptiness her own words had revealed. Later that night, as Grace wrote carefully in her journal beside the window, she glanced toward the main house where the vast yellow lights glowed against the glass panes like a series of watchful, unblinking eyes. Something was profoundly wrong. A simple, random car accident did not explain the fortress-like, obsessive security, nor the haunted, vague look in Sophia's story, nor the cold, impenetrable silence Nathaniel Moretti carried with him everywhere like a second skin. Every step Grace took deeper inside this immense estate felt like another step into a complex labyrinth woven intricately with dangerous secrets. But deep inside, she had already made her binding choice. For Sophia, for the way the child looked at her, as if she were a rare, necessary place of absolute safety. Fortress or not, mystery or not, Grace would not leave while the girl still needed her. That late afternoon, while Sophia studied quietly with her tutor in the mansion library, Grace used the unexpected quiet to investigate the old, imposing cabinet tucked away in the corner of the cottage living room. She spotted a heavy wooden box on the topmost shelf, placed far back against the wall. Reaching up was physically impossible. Her shoulder screamed in anticipation of protest at the mere thought of movement. She dragged a heavy, antique chair over, gritting her teeth against the sharp flare of pain in her healing ribs with every scraping, agonizing step. Standing precariously on her toes, she didn't try to lift the box directly. Instead, she used her good right hand to slowly, agonizingly inch the heavy wooden box toward the very edge of the shelf. Teetered dangerously on the lip, Grace held her breath, bracing herself, and let it finally tip, catching the sudden, heavy weight against her uninjured side. The impact nearly knocked her completely over, forcing a choked, desperate cry from her lips as the sudden jolt rattled her healing bones. She sank instantly to the floor, trembling and breathless, clutching the box to her like a lifeline until the black spots dancing across her vision began to clear. Grace waited, the pain slowly receding to a manageable throb, before she finally opened the first box. One box held a stack of old photo albums, their dark leather covers soft and frayed at the corners from years of handling. She sat down on the rug and began turning the brittle pages, slowly uncovering fragments of a previous life once vibrantly lived on this very estate. There were smiling family pictures taken in the garden, photos of a much younger Sophia, nestled securely in the arms of a woman with long dark hair and a uniquely gentle smile. Grace did not need to ask to know this was Isabel, Sophia's mother. She turned the pages slowly and watched time unfold in snapshots of birthdays, sunlit picnics, and quiet, intensely domestic moments. Isabel appeared in nearly every single frame, always at the center, a woman defined by her softness and a quality of unexplained sadness that always seemed to linger just behind her expressive eyes. Then Grace stopped abruptly. In the middle of one album was a photograph of Isabel standing before a sleek, silver-blue convertible. Her long hair was caught beautifully in the wind as she laughed up at whoever held the camera. But it was not the expensive car or the woman's joyful expression that instantly trapped Grace's gaze. It was the necklace. A thin chain of delicate white gold holding a precisely cut amethyst pendant shaped unmistakably into a six-pointed star. Grace froze, the world outside the photo album dissolving. She had seen that specific necklace before. Without question. It was the same necklace worn by the only eyewitness, the one who briefly glanced back, to the brutal shooting that killed Liam, her younger brother, nearly a decade ago. Grace remembered it with painful, sickening clarity because she had stared endlessly at the grainy, single CCTV still the police released when desperately appealing for witnesses. Among the small crowd of fleeing people, one woman had turned her head back for a fraction of a second, her star pendant catching the bright streetlight like a solitary star momentarily visible in the dark chaos, and then she vanished completely. No name was ever attached, no statement was given, no court appearance occurred. The case immediately collapsed for lack of viable evidence, and Liam's death dissolved into the forgotten tragedies of children caught in brutal battles they never belonged to. Grace touched the photograph with trembling fingers, her heartbeat now pounding violently against her ribs. Could not possibly be coincidence. Isabel Moretti, the woman said to have died tragically in a car crash 3 years ago, might have been present the very night Liam was murdered. She might have seen everything. She might know the truth. Grace leaned back in the chair, a terrible surge of emotions rising in a chaos she could barely contain. Blinding anger, cold confusion, paralyzing fear, and a fierce, immediate need to pull aggressively at every single thread she could find. If Isabel truly was the woman she remembered from the CCTV, why was she there that night? Why had she subsequently disappeared entirely? And why had her name, her face, and her necklace returned to Grace's life precisely now, when she had nearly surrendered her desperate search for answers? She closed her eyes, seeing a flash of Liam at 13, his shy, hopeful smile, the uneven birthday cake their mother had baked with all her flawed love. When she opened her eyes, she closed the album slowly and held it tightly against her chest, as though it were the missing, irreplaceable piece of a long broken puzzle. Perhaps fate had not placed her beside Sophia simply out of random kindness alone. Perhaps she was drawn or dragged into this dangerous place for a reason far larger, tethered by an invisible, agonizing line stretched taut from the blood on a Bronx sidewalk to the very guarded doors of this mansion. And she knew from that very moment that she could no longer pretend. She had to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything she had managed to build with Sophia. Grace did not sleep at all that night. After tucking Sophia into bed, finishing the familiar bedtime story about the brave princess and her wolf companion, she returned silently to the cottage living room, closed the heavy velvet curtains tightly across the window, and opened the worn laptop she had carefully carried from her tiny Queens apartment. She typed Isabel Moretti into the search bar, but the results were vague and heavily managed, dominated by society features, gossip magazines, and glossy photographs from Nate's charity events. Nothing mentioned the supposed car crash in any detail. There were no official reports, no public death records, only a brief, 3-year-old notice stating that Isabel Moretti died in a rainy night highway accident with no survivors, no scene photos, no police confirmation, nothing remotely verifiable. A cold, unnerving ripple moved through Grace's spine. She refined her search, forcing herself to recall every minute detail of the grainy CCTV image from Liam's case file. The woman had been labeled a key witness, but was never identified or found. She typed, Bronx shooting 2012, missing witness. The first result was an old local broadcast naming the woman as Isabel Vega, age 30, the primary witness in a case tied deeply to the Castellanos cartel, one of the most dangerous, entrenched drug families in New York at the time. According to the news report, she had initially agreed to testify after being arrested in a massive federal raid, entering witness protection in exchange for full cooperation. But only weeks later, she vanished completely from the system. No records, no sightings, nothing. She disappeared as thoroughly as though she had never existed at all. Grace stared intently at the name Isabel Vega, then back at the photo of Isabel Moretti in the album on the table. It was impossible to ignore the startling connection. The pieces began aligning with unnerving, deadly precision. If Isabel had once been Isabel Vega, if she had lived under witness protection, then what did her high-profile marriage to Nathaniel Moretti mean? A sheer coincidence or a highly calculated move? And if so, was her supposed accident truly an accident, or was it the final, brutal silencing of someone who knew too much? Grace's pulse quickened to a frantic beat. She searched public databases, dug through old court archives, but nearly everything linked to the case had been sealed or professionally erased. All she uncovered was a skeletal FBI entry noting Isabel Vega as missing, presumed endangered by the Castellanos organization. With the entire case still officially unresolved, she leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning wildly through fragments and terrible possibilities. She thought of Sophia, of Nate's controlled intensity, of the cold, watchful shadow in Elena's eyes. They might all know the truth. Perhaps only Grace did not. Or worse, perhaps only Grace still wanted to know. The instinct of someone who has lost a loved one violently never truly quiets. And now it whispered fiercely, incontestably at her ear. Isabel Moretti did not die in a car accident. Isabel Moretti had once been Isabel Vega, and that perilous past had not faded into oblivion. Grace closed the laptop, her heart still trembling from the shock of the revelation. In the thick, absolute hush of the midnight hours, she understood she had stepped much deeper into a dangerous maze. But she also understood something else with startling clarity. If there was any road left that could lead her to the truth about Liam, about the woman in that blurred photograph, about the moment her life had snapped in two, then that road began here inside this luxurious fortress named Moretti. And she would not turn back. Not when the answers were finally, agonizingly within reach. The next morning, as Grace was slowly washing glasses in the little cottage kitchen, the door opened without warning or a knock. Marco stood silently at the threshold, a polite, utterly professional smile on his lips, though nothing in his dark eyes resembled true friendliness. He wore a crisp black shirt, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, carrying himself with the unsettling ease of someone who had stepped through this doorway 100 times before, always on command. Grace turned abruptly, her pulse catching for a moment. Marco was the head of security for the entire estate. A man who spoke little, but seemed always to appear exactly where he intended, his gaze sharp and cold as a newly honed blade. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said, his voice warm in tone, but calculated in every syllable. "I only wanted to make sure you are comfortable here. Mr. Moretti values the safety of his family above all else, and you are now part of that." Grace set the last glass onto the drying rack, wiped her damp hands slowly on a kitchen towel, and kept her voice measured and calm. "Thank you. I am getting used to everything." Marco stepped further inside, his gaze sweeping the room quickly, assessing not only the physical space, but critically her. "You are careful. I like that quality. But sometimes being too curious is not good for one's health, especially in a place like this. The wrong questions can lead to unnecessary trouble." Grace felt her heartbeat tighten sharply in warning. She said nothing, meeting his cool stare steadily, refusing to break contact first. Marco allowed a faint, indifferent smile to cross his face, then lifted the framed drawing from the table beside the armchair and examined it quietly. It was Sophia's picture with the earnest words "Grace and Sophia, best friends forever." He studied it a moment longer than necessary, then set it back down precisely where he had found it. "Sophia is very fond of you and Mr. Moretti as well. That is why I came, only to remind you that peace here is maintained by order. Everyone has a role, and if someone steps outside that defined role, everything becomes immediately unbalanced." Without waiting for a response, Marco turned and walked out, leaving Grace standing in profound silence, her mind tangled in the kind of chilling warning that was vague enough to avoid direct accusation, but utterly unmistakable in its deadly intent. Later that afternoon, Elena stopped by the cottage to check Grace's bandages and mobility. Her appearance was as composed as ever. But when she sat across from Grace in the living room, her eyes no longer carried their usual practiced neutrality. "Marco was here?" she asked bluntly, Grace nodded and repeated the substance of the conversation, leaving nothing out. Elena listened carefully, her dark brows tightening before she fell quiet for a long, heavy moment. "Do not look into anything else, Grace," she said at last, her voice soft, but carrying an absolute, unmistakable authority. "No one here likes being watched or questioned. And Marco is not only head of security. He is the person Nate trusts implicitly with everything. When something needs to be handled quietly, doing that the law cannot handle." Grace wanted to ask more, but the words withered on her tongue. The atmosphere had become too heavy for further inquiry. She simply nodded, accepting the boundary. That evening, as she walked with Sophia through the enclosed garden behind the guest cottage, the air grew cool and carried the scent of wet earth and jasmine. She felt it again. The unmistakable, unsettling sensation of being watched. A faint, almost imperceptible rustle in the dense shrubs near the boundary wall, followed by the fleeting glimpse of a black sleeve disappearing behind a sheet of heavy, mossy stone. When she spun around, the path was empty. The sudden quiet settled around them. A perfect, deceptive calm as though nothing had happened. But the fine hairs on the back of her neck prickled with alarm. For the first time since she had arrived at the estate, the cottage no longer felt like a haven. The high walls, the sophisticated cameras, the silent guards, none of it existed solely to protect someone from the outside world. It was also a meticulously constructed system of vigilance, of absolute control, designed to monitor every shadow and every whispered breath within its boundaries. And now, she realized, she had stepped too close to the center of the storm Nate was trying to contain. She began to understand that if Isabel truly had been silenced, then that terrible truth was not merely hidden. It was being actively guarded behind layers of sophisticated danger, and the next person at risk might very well be her. 2 days after Marco's quiet, loaded warning, the air around the cottage felt inexplicably heavier, saturated with unspoken tension. Grace sensed unseen eyes tracking her wherever she moved. She felt that even her smallest, most unconscious gestures were being observed through a clinical lens she could not locate. Yet that chilling feeling only sharpened her desperate need to understand, to tear away whatever luxurious, deceptive veil the estate had wrapped around the lives of Sophia and Nate. One afternoon, when the amber light of the late day streamed through the elaborate stained glass window in the main hall, scattering colors like a magnificent chapel mosaic across the enclosed garden, Grace sat with Sophia. The child was arranging delicate lavender sprigs into a small glass jar made from an old jam container, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scene appeared perfectly peaceful, yet a suffocating sense of weight hovered beneath the stillness. Grace reached out and brushed Sophia's soft hair gently, then asked in the softest, most carefully modulated tone, "My sweetheart, do you miss your mother very much?" Sophia lifted her eyes. They were quiet, deep, and far older than a 7-year-old's should be. "Yes, I dream of her every night, but she always stands far away from me, near the edge of a field, like she does not want me to come closer." Grace swallowed hard, her throat tightening painfully. "Does your father ever tell you more about her? About what happened that made her leave?" Sophia began to twist the hem of her shirt, hesitating for a long moment. Then she leaned in and whispered, her voice barely audible, as though afraid a breeze might carry the secret away. "I once heard Dad fighting with Uncle Marco. I was hiding under the stairs that night because I was scared of the thunder. Dad was so angry. He shouted something. He said, 'They found her.'" Grace's heart lurched violently against her ribs. "They? Who are they, darling?" Sophia shook her head quickly. "I do not know. Dad just kept repeating it. They found her, and if I do not act first, my daughter will be next." Then he slammed his hand on the table so hard the glasses rattled. Grace sat perfectly still as the scattered, confusing pieces of the puzzle slid into terrifying focus. Nate was not simply a grieving, broken husband or a father raising a child alone in the shadow of tragedy. He was investigating something vast and dangerous. He was actively tracking the cold shadow of a threat surrounding Isabel's death. And he clearly did not believe the sanitized story everyone else repeated about a random car accident. Grace tightened her hold on Sophia's small, damp hand. "Are you afraid, Sophia?" Sophia looked up slowly and shook her head, her gaze clear. Not when I am with you. Grace managed a fragile smile, though a dark storm had already risen inside her. A hurricane of realization and impending risk. Nate knew far more than he showed. He was deliberately holding back something enormous, something that required constant, ruthless protection. And if what Sophia heard was true, Isabel had not been killed by chance, but because she had been perceived as a significant threat, or because she had carried a secret powerful enough to silence her forever. That night, long after Sophia had finally drifted into a deep, protected sleep, Grace left the guest house. She walked down the long, cold corridor that led toward the main house, her footsteps muffled by the expensive runner rug. The lights on the lower floor of the mansion were still burning late, casting warm, rectangular glows across the heavy stone floor. She stayed hidden behind a row of immense pillars, positioning herself so she could clearly see Nate standing alone near the fireplace. He held a glass of dark red wine, staring fixedly into the orange blaze, his face a mask of cold, concentrated resolve. On the mahogany table beside him lay an open, disorganized stack of documents, including several pages that resembled high-resolution satellite images and complex location schematics. This was not the posture of a man drowning in hopeless grief. This was the meticulous preparation of an operative, calculating angles and threats. He was preparing for what exactly? Revenge, revelation, or both? Grace could not guess. But she understood then that the storm swirling around her was not merely the sad echo of a broken family. It was the visible tip of something vast, lethal, and hidden, a powerful unseen force capable of pulling all of them, Sophia, Nate, and now herself, into its crushing depths. It was well past 2 a.m. The last vestiges of the birthday celebration had ended hours ago, and the massive estate had settled into a heavy, watchful silence. Grace couldn't sleep. The dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder was a persistent reminder of her own precarious reality. She walked down the hallway to get a glass of water and noticed that the library door was slightly ajar, a fragile sliver of yellow light cutting through the surrounding darkness. She hesitated, then pushed the heavy oak door open gently, intending only to ensure that everything was secure. Nathaniel was there, but he wasn't working. He was slumped deeply in his high-backed leather chair, his head leaned back. A half-empty glass of amber whiskey rested near his hand, and his breathing was deep, slow, and rhythmic. He had finally fallen asleep, succumbing to the profound exhaustion he hid so expertly during the day. The fortress, Grace realized, did have a flaw. It wasn't the walls or the cameras. It was the man inside, carrying the entire weight of the world on his wide shoulders. Grace stepped closer, her initial impulse to drape a thick woolen blanket over him, but her movement froze entirely. The dark mahogany desk was scattered with maps and official-looking documents covered in complex ciphers, coded timelines, and dense annotations. Nate wasn't just reading, he was decoding. Most of the files were stamped classified, in angry red ink or obscured by thick black marker redactions. But in his deep exhaustion, he had allowed one sheet to slip out from under the heavy whiskey tumbler. It wasn't a name that caught her eye first. It was a face. Half hidden beneath the weight of the glass was a grainy, low-quality surveillance photograph of a man she had hated, obsessed over, and hunted for 5 relentless years. And next to the photo, circled aggressively in vivid red ink, was a precise location. Queens, Sector 4. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped closer, her hand trembling violently as she reached out. The key, the truth, the vengeance, it wasn't locked away in some impenetrable vault. It was right there, staring back at her from the chilling abyss of the past. She knew she didn't have time to read everything, so her eyes skimmed quickly for the crucial information. A prominent heading leapt out at her: Castellano's internal network, suspected connections to Vega case. Beneath it was a list of names. Many of them crossed out with harsh red lines, but 2 names nearly made her drop the entire file from sheer shock: Hector Jimenez and Luis Arana. Those were the names of the men who had been aggressively hunted, then disappeared after the Bronx shooting, the same brutal street violence that had killed Liam. She remembered their photos taped to the plaster wall of her cramped apartment, the desperate, anonymous questions she had posted in dark corners of the internet. And now their names sat here in Nate Moretti's private, highly classified dossier. The next page showed a complicated network diagram with thick arrows linking the Castellanos cartel, several minor political figures, and a list of police officers once suspected of taking systemic bribes. At the very center of it all was a faded photo of Isabel Moretti, identified underneath by her real name, Isabel Vega. The photo was circled once, fiercely, in red. The attached notes under the photo made Grace's blood run ice cold. Primary witness, Bronx shooting case. Number 4's Arrow Duo. Date, 5 years ago. Subject fled protective custody with infant daughter, age 12 months. Status, missing. Grace's lungs seemed to stop working. The math was horrifyingly perfect. The timeline was identical. 5 years ago, a woman named Isabel witnessed Liam's death while holding a baby girl. A baby who was now the 6-year-old child drawing castles in the garden. Nate was tracking everything. He was not simply mourning. He was actively hunting the people who had manipulated and murdered his wife. And he clearly did not believe the official story. He must be doing it alone, or with a tiny, trusted inner circle. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and rage. She glanced further down the page and froze. Hector Jimenez, the man who killed Liam. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of the file paper. She had to know everything. She reached out, ready to slide the paper free. But before her fingertips could even graze the surface, the air in the room shifted violently. In a dizzying blur of motion, the sleeping man vanished. A hand clamped around Grace's wrist like a vice made of iron, twisting her arm back with terrifying, professional speed. Grace gasped, stifling a sharp cry as she was slammed hard against the edge of the mahogany bookshelf. Trapped, she looked up. Nate was no longer asleep. He was standing over her, his breathing controlled, his eyes dark, hard, and utterly empty of recognition. In his other hand, a heavy, ornate letter opener was pressed dangerously close to her jugular vein. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, he wasn't a father or a sophisticated cafe regular. He was a weapon honed and lethal. Then his eyes cleared. He blinked, the cold steel in his gaze fracturing instantly as he realized who he was pinning against the wood. Grace! His voice was a low, rough growl. He dropped the makeshift weapon, which clattered harmlessly onto the desk, but he did not release her wrist. You have a death wish walking in here like that. Grace did not flinch, though her heart felt ready to burst through her chest wall. She stood her ground in the dim, lamplit study, locking her eyes onto his. I saw the names, she said, her voice trembling slightly but undeniably clear. Hector Jimenez and Luis Serrana. Nate's eyes narrowed dangerously, the coldness rushing back. You had no right to touch those. Liam, my little brother? She whispered, the familiar, searing pain of loss making her voice waver. They killed him, on an afternoon 6 years ago in the Bronx. He was only 13. The shooting was meant to settle a score, but my brother, he was just a kid buying ice cream. Nate moved back slightly, slowly, the hardness in his gaze beginning to fissure, replaced by a deep, weary comprehension. I searched for them for 3 years, Grace confessed, the words pouring out. But no one believed me. No cop cared. Everyone called it a community mishap. I could not let him fade into nothing. She looked down at the file and then back at him. And when I saw Isabel wearing that necklace, I knew her death and Liam's were connected. Silence fell between them, thick and cold, like a crack spreading across frozen water. Nate simply stared at her, the initial surge of protective anger dissolving into something quieter, something profoundly bewildered and sorrowful. Do you have proof? He finally asked, his voice raw. Not much. Only small pieces, scattered traces that lead nowhere. Grace raised her chin, her gaze steady. But when I saw your investigation, those names, that photo of Isabel circled in red, I knew you were searching for the exact same thing I was. Nate turned away, his broad shoulders sinking under the sudden, immense weight of shared memory and responsibility. After a long, agonizing pause, he spoke, still facing the wall. Isabel did not die in an accident. She was once a confidential witness in a major human trafficking case. The government put her in witness protection under the name Isabel Vega. But then, she vanished from the system. He paused, breathing deeply. I think she was betrayed. I think someone inside sold her information and her location to the Castellanos people. Grace felt her hands trembling fiercely. Then Sophia. Nate nodded once, curtly. Sophia knows nothing. I tried to keep her out of all of it, keep the past buried. But they are circling back now. They didn't just want to silence Isabel. They wanted to make sure no one in her immediate family survived long enough to speak the truth. Grace stepped closer, her eyes fixed urgently on his retreating back. Then let me help you. Nate shook his head instantly. You have helped too much already. You nearly died for that child in the restaurant. I cannot let you go deeper into this. I do not have another choice, she countered fiercely. Do you think I can go back to waiting tables, pretending nothing happened, while the men who killed my brother walk free? If you walk away from this now, I will continue alone. But if you want justice for Isabel, I am here. We share the same enemy. Their eyes met again. Finally, the space between them dissolving entirely. Two souls carved deep by loss and injustice, recognizing each other in a moment that left no room for doubt or polite refusal. Nate nodded slowly. It wasn't a promise of safety, and it wasn't forgiveness for her trespassing. It was an unspoken, solemn pact between two people who had both looked straight into the face of absolute darkness and survived. They did not just share an enemy. They shared a devastating wound, and now they shared a single focused purpose. That night, they sat across from each other in the silent warmth of Nate's study. The single lamp cast a warm, concentrated light over the files spread open before them. The distance was gone, the suspicion evaporated, leaving only two people meticulously piecing together a terrifying truth neither of them wanted to see, but both understood they could no longer avoid. Nate lifted a photograph. A small, familiar picture of Isabel with soft curls and sorrowful eyes, standing in front of a small storefront. The corner of the picture was torn, but her fierce smile was still intact. Isabel was not killed by chance, he murmured, his voice dry and brittle as night wind brushing stone walls. She fought back. As Isabel Vega, she had been the only witness willing to expose a massive human trafficking and money laundering network tied directly to the Castellano cartel. But after her first preliminary hearing, her confidential file was leaked. Nate believed firmly that someone inside the system had sold her out, forcing her to run instantly with her 1-year-old daughter. They found her only 2 years later, Nate continued, his jaw tight. The car accident was a surgical cover. Her brakes had been professionally tampered with, and crucial nearby traffic cameras were shut down for exactly 5 minutes before and after the crash. No official investigation, no questions asked. I know they are still out there, Nate said, his eyes like polished blades in the lamplight. They thought killing her was the end, the final step. But they didn't know I recorded a conversation between Isabel and one of their informants before she died. He told her, point blank, if you do not disappear, we will take the child. Grace shivered violently, the cold permeating her bones. And now they are coming for Sophia. Nate nodded. They do not know yet that I have the physical evidence and the informant recording, but they will eventually. And then the child becomes leverage again. Grace bowed her head, thinking of Sophia's brave little eyes and the drawing she had made with the words, best friends forever. She would not allow another child to live in fear, as Liam had, as she herself had for years. What do we do now? Nate pulled an electronic map from a drawer beneath the desk. The map was covered with blinking red points that marked underground Castellano operations in New Jersey and Queens, sites he had monitored for more than a year. He pointed out locations tied to laundering operations and one specific site suspected of being an archive used for blackmail files and target lists. I need to get inside and retrieve the hard drives, he stated simply. Only a direct, physical recovery will force the government to reopen the Vega case and connect it to the cartel. Grace studied the glowing map without hesitation. I am going with you. Nate looked at her fully this time, without protest or anger, only clear assessment. You understand this could kill you. Grace exhaled a weary, deliberate sigh. I risked my life the day I stepped into Romano's and shielded Sophia. I stopped being safe the moment I met her. They spent the rest of the night planning. Nate would contact an elite hacker, someone once close to the target, the only person skilled enough to decode the data they hoped to retrieve. Grace would cross-reference the remaining names and faces using the memory of the men she had hunted for 5 years to identify the cartel operatives the system had missed. They divided roles, calculated optimal entry routes, plotted escape points, and timed every movement. When the clock on the mantel struck 3, marking the beginning of a relentless new day, Grace leaned back in her chair. Do we have a real chance of winning this? Nate looked toward the dark, reflecting window, his face unreadable. I do not know, but if we do nothing, they will return again and again. And next time, they may not hesitate with Sophia. Grace rose and approached him. Then let us end it once and for all. Nate looked at her, and for the first time, a small, weary smile flickered across his face. Soft, inevitable, like a wordless oath exchanged between two strangers who were, profoundly, no longer strangers at all. Neither of them was a conventional hero, but both had lost far too much to turn back now. They stood on the same side, not simply for revenge, but to end a cycle of violence and impunity. The storm began pouring after midnight, heavy, aggressive drops falling as though the sky were emptying everything it had withheld for weeks. In the estate's hidden surveillance room, the screens monitoring the outer perimeter flickered with unusual motion near the dense woods behind the house. Elena leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the feed. They are coming, she said, her voice entirely flat, devoid of emotion. At that same moment, Nate entered from the main hall, his shirt buttoned tight, his preferred combat weapon secured at his hip, his gaze cold and focused as forged steel. He had expected this. The timing was perfect, right after the infiltration plan had stalled when his data revealed the cartel leader was relocating. Grace woke to the sharp, brief sound of the internal alarm that echoed through the guest house. She ran instantly from her room and found Sophia already gathered securely in Elena's arms. Downstairs, Elena was already issuing clipped instructions. Panic room now? No explanations were needed. Grace held Sophia close as they rushed down a narrow, concealed corridor leading to the hidden chamber behind a heavy bookshelf. The panic room resembled a miniature bunker, with thick steel walls, independent ventilation, screens showing exterior feeds, and an internal communication line. The door sealed behind them with a heavy, hydraulic hiss just as the first distant shot exploded outside. Sophia trembled against Grace's chest, but her eyes remained wide, brave, and resolute enough to make Grace's heart ache with protective love. Are you all right? Grace whispered, smoothing the child's hair. I am not leaving you. I trust you, Sophia answered, gripping Grace's shirt tightly. Outside, the attack had fully begun. Black-clad intruders moved with frightening military precision, surrounding the estate from all 4 cardinal directions. But Nate had anticipated their exact strategy. From the rooftops and hidden turrets, his most loyal fighters, those who owed Isabel their lives or their freedom, opened immediate, coordinated fire. Elena joined the battle the instant the steel door closed, rolling across the corridor floor and taking down the first intruder before he could even raise his weapon. The heavy rain slicked the guns and blurred the sight lines, but it also masked their movement. Lightning flashed frequently, illuminating faces twisted in fierce concentration, guns spitting arcs of fire, and dark blood beginning to pool across the ancient stone paving. Nate moved like a quiet, disciplined storm, shifting between positions with the cold economy of a man who had lived through more real battles than he had ever described. He did not shout. He did not falter. He simply signaled and struck. An ear-splitting explosion rattled the garage structure as the enemy tried a secondary entry point. Nate countered immediately, directing a crossfire barrage. Bullets shattered glass violently. 2 attackers dropped heavily. Inside the panic room, Grace watched the live feeds helplessly, yet knew that her composure was absolutely everything to Sophia. Each time a shot rang out, she tightened her protective hold. Time stretched thin and agonizing. Then the screen switched to a triumphant warning signal. The leader had been captured. Castellanos himself lay bound and sprawled on the wet stone, his face bloodied, but undeniably alive. One of Nate's men stood over him, a rifle pressed to his temple. Nate approached, his eyes burning with years of suppressed fury. "You thought you could end my family the way you ended Isabel." Castellanos let out a guttural, wet laugh, but the cold terror of capture had already hollowed out his stare. Nate did not shoot. Instead, he gestured sharply. "Bring him to the secondary bunker. Prepare to hand him over. I want him alive long enough to talk to the right people." Elena contacted Grace immediately on the internal line. "It is over. He is captured. No more threats, Grace." The panic room door hissed open. Grace gathered Sophia tightly in her arms and stepped out into the cool, rain-washed air of the corridor. The estate still stood tall, carrying the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder and blood, but it remained the only place Sophia had left to call home. And now, after a night that felt carved from pure nightmare, Grace understood something with absolute clarity. They were no longer running. They had just survived the worst of the storm. The sun rose slowly, hesitantly, after a night that had felt as if even the sky itself had grown weary from watching too much blood spill and too much fear take root. In the pale, watery morning light that followed the ambush, the Moretti estate no longer resembled a cold fortress, but a trench that had somehow endured the storm's worst fury. Shattered windows had been quickly covered with canvas sheeting. Bullet scars still pressed deeply into the stone walls. Yet inside, the air had softened, quieted, settling into a fragile peace. Grace sat carefully on a simple wooden chair in the sun-drenched reading room of the guest house. A thick white bandage was wrapped around her left arm where a bullet had grazed her skin. The dull, constant ache that pulsed each time she moved was a persistent reminder that she was still breathing, still here, and that Sophia, the little girl only a few steps away, was still safe. The child sat concentrated on the rug with a nearly spent box of colored pencils, drawing with intense, silent focus, until she finally held the page up with a shy mix of pride and vulnerability. "I made this for you," she said softly. Grace took the drawing and felt a sharp, immediate tightening in her throat. Against a sky shaded with pale blue pencil stood a small, stout stone castle with sturdy red roof tiles. Not grand, not imposing, but warm, with smoke curling invitingly from its chimney and glowing windows. On the grassy lawn in front were 3 tiny figures holding hands. A little girl, a woman with brown hair, and a tall man standing protectively beside them. And beneath the scene, in Sophia's uneven, laborious handwriting, were the words, "Our real castle." Grace ran her fingertips gently over the page as silent tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had once believed she would never have anything resembling a home again. Not after all she had lost. Not after Liam's death and the years of drifting and surviving. Yet here, in a child's fragile, hopeful drawing, she saw a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. Nate appeared in the doorway, his powerful frame momentarily filling the space, his expression softening instantly at the sight of them. After a quiet moment, he stepped inside and sat across from her. "The doctor says the wound will heal quickly if you rest properly," he murmured, his voice lower and gentler than she had ever heard it, carrying the weight of an unexpected tenderness. Grace gave him a tired, slightly tremulous smile. "I have survived worse than this, much worse." They settled into a deep, comfortable silence. The only audible sound was the faint, rhythmic rustle of Sophia adding intricate, meticulous details to the drawing of her magnificent castle. "You can leave," Nate finally said, the hesitation in his voice unmistakable, a raw edge betraying the effort it took to speak the words. "I will cover all medical bills, the travel expenses, Everything you need to start fresh somewhere else. You have done more than anyone could ever ask. More than I deserved. He stopped, swallowing hard, as if the next crucial words had caught painfully somewhere between his chest and his voice box. But I hope you will stay. Grace lifted her eyes to meet his gaze. In his eyes, she no longer saw the cold, impenetrable man she had met on that devastating first day, but a father stripped bare of his defenses. A bruised and grateful man who carried his immense gratitude like a heavy shadow he did not possess the vocabulary to name. Sophia needs you, he added quietly, the words barely a breath. And I think I do too. Grace lowered her head, tracing the rough edge of the drawing with the tip of her index finger. She did not answer right away. A protective, instinctual part of her still trembled, still held back, knowing instinctively that this place, Nate Moretti's world, was not a simple dream of safety. It came inextricably tied to shadows, ancient secrets, and latent danger. And yet, it was here, in the heart of the storm, that she had unexpectedly found her first steady flicker of light after what felt like years of unyielding darkness. I do not know how long I will stay, she whispered, the uncertainty still clinging to the edges of her confession. But I am not ready to leave. Nate simply nodded once, a gesture that conveyed profound understanding. Light, he knew, was a promise that needed no further complex words. Sophia, sensing the shift in the adult atmosphere, dashed over with a joyful squeal and wrapped her small arms tightly around Grace's leg. The heavily detailed drawing was still clutched fiercely in her hand. It looks like a real castle, doesn't it? Grace gathered the child into a gentle embrace, smiling down at her. Yes, sweet princess. But a real castle is not merely the kind with tall, imposing towers or deep moats. It is wherever you feel truly safe, wherever you feel you belong. And for the first time in a very long time, Grace felt the deep, profound satisfaction that she was no longer merely surviving the next day. She was living within it. 1 year later, on a gentle, crisp autumn morning in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, the comforting scent of freshly baked waffles and richly roasted coffee drifted invitingly from the large, open windows of a small cafe tucked quietly at a street corner. The charming wooden sign hanging above the entrance bore a name, written simply in chalk lettering, faded slightly by the weather: Liam's Kitchen. Inside, Grace Monroe, her movements efficient and practiced, wiped down the polished counter with a checkered cloth. Her dark hair was pulled neatly back, secured with a simple clasp, and a beige apron printed with a tiny, whimsical cupcake was tied around her waist. The cafe's name was more than just a label. It was a profound tribute. Liam was the little brother she had lost too soon on a single violent night that had brutally shattered the world she knew. And now, instead of allowing his memory to remain only as raw, consuming grief, she had skillfully turned it into a powerful, tangible purpose, into a warm, welcoming place where life, laughter, and warmth could tentatively begin again. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed, a familiar, musical sound, and Sophia rushed in, her small kitten-shaped backpack bouncing slightly. Her cheeks flushed a bright pink from the sharp autumn chill outside. "Miss Grace," she called out brightly, her voice full of excitement. Grace turned immediately, her smile open and genuine, warming the small cafe like the slant of morning sunlight streaming through the window panes. "Hello, my princess. What culinary masterpiece shall we bake today?" "Star cookies. And maybe with rainbow sprinkles, too, of course," she declared with a serious nod. Grace gathered the child into their familiar weekend embrace just as Nate stepped silently through the door behind her. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored wool coat and a soft, expensive gray scarf. He offered a quiet, reserved nod to Grace, his eyes holding a gaze that was both quiet and immensely warm. There were no grand declarations of love between them, no confession carved aggressively into the charged air. Yet, every shared look across the counter, every slow, Saturday morning spent drinking coffee while silently watching Sophia confidently knead dough, was its own complete and quiet vow. In the small, bustling kitchen behind the cafe, Grace showed Sophia how to carefully press the cookie cutters and sprinkle the fine sugar evenly. She no longer even remotely resembled the exhausted, terrified woman who had once lived confined in a damp, anonymous Queens apartment. She was now a resilient cafe owner, a thoughtful mentor, a woman who had found enough steadiness and confidence within herself to teach a once frightened little girl how to truly laugh again. On the simple, painted walls were framed photographs. There was Liam grinning widely beside a crooked, slightly lopsided birthday cake from their childhood. Sophia, in her crisp school uniform, holding her worn, beloved rabbit, Mr. Hops, and a recent, poignant shot of Nate standing self-consciously beside Grace behind the bar on opening day. Their expressions a mixture of relief and pride. Under each frame was a tiny, heartfelt caption written by Sophia in colorful marker, her developing handwriting rounded and earnest. A real family is wherever you feel safe. This place is our castle. Liam lives in every cake. By late afternoon, as the crowd of customers finally thinned, Grace sat by the window, calmly sipping her chamomile tea while Sophia carefully wrote out the next day's menu in her meticulous, rounded handwriting. The low golden light of the fading day caught the fine strands of the child's hair, turning the whole intimate scene tender and full of quiet meaning. Grace breathed a long, steady, cleansing breath. She had not forgotten the past. The echoing bullets, the lingering nightmares, the grief still lingered like faint, silver scars. But she had fundamentally learned how to live beside them without ever letting them completely swallow her whole. She had built a small but incredibly solid world, one where love was not a fragile luxury, but a constant, daily presence. And within this slow, comforting rhythm of flour dust and brown sugar, and the soft sound of laughter, Grace Monroe was no longer simply the woman who once threw herself in front of a child to shield her from gunfire. She was now an irreplaceable part of Sophia's life, the devoted keeper of Liam's beautiful memory, and a woman who had learned the hard, necessary art of transforming overwhelming sorrow into a lasting, cherished home. Every Saturday morning, the bell above Liam's kitchen rang with a familiar, anticipated chime, and Grace always knew exactly who had walked in, even before she bothered to look up from the counter. Nate Moretti came without announcement, without ever needing a formal invitation. He always immediately took the same table near the window where the light fell just right across the newspaper he held in his hand. And he always ordered the exact same thing without fail. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream, but it had to be brewed specifically by Grace herself. No one in the cafe ever questioned anything about the silent, well-dressed man. No one asked who he truly was, because here, in the specific corner of the world, he was simply naturally part of the warm weekend ritual. The man who smiled quietly, a genuine, private smile, whenever Sophia came bursting out of the kitchen, triumphantly holding up a cookie she and Grace had made together. There was no frantic, hurried romance between them. No sudden, passionate kiss exchanged among the trays of pastries. No grand, sweeping declaration of love, whispered in the small, flour-dusted kitchen. Their deep, resilient bond grew instead out of much quieter, more enduring things. The glance that lingered a moment too long, the subtle softening of an expression when one of them was visibly tired, or the simple, consistent way Nate always stayed until closing, helping Grace wipe down the last table without ever having to say a single word. Once, late in the evening while Grace was wiping the counter and Nate stood across from her, idly tapping his fingertips absently on the smooth wooden surface, she lifted her eyes and caught his gaze. She did not smile, but her gaze shimmered, deep and expressive, as though some inner truth about their connection had just finally settled into its rightful place. "I once thought you would certainly leave," Nate said, his voice low and rich, not regretful but deeply honest. Grace set the cloth aside deliberately and straightened up, leaning back against the counter. "I thought so, too. I was terrified that if I stayed, the past would inevitably find me again, that I would lose something else precious. But then I realized this is not a place I came to hide from the world. It is a place I fiercely chose, to keep living, to keep building." Nate nodded slowly, thoughtfully, as though each word she spoke reached and quieted something deep inside him he rarely allowed to surface or be seen. "I have lost many things, Isabel, my trust in the world, even myself for a long time. But with you, things feel fundamentally different. Things feel like they are finally starting to heal." They needed no more defining words. That afternoon, they sat long after the closing sign had been flipped. When Sophia had gone home with the sitter and the cafe was wrapped in silence, broken only by the soft clink of spoons against mugs, they spoke openly about the past, about the sleepless nights haunted by violent echoes, about the mornings when they both questioned whether the new day was even worth trying for. And then they laughed, a shared, necessary sound, because both of them were still here, side by side, having chosen again to try. One crisp spring morning, Grace found a small, fragrant lavender plant placed carefully at her door with a simple, unmarked card that read, "For the one who stayed." She knew instantly, with absolute certainty, who had left it. No signature was needed. The firm, careful handwriting gave him entirely away. She brought the lavender inside and set it prominently on the sunny windowsill, its gentle, calming scent drifting through the cafe like a physical reminder that sometimes love did not require dramatic, theatrical gestures. It only needed to endure quietly, deeply enough to hold and support two people who had once been shattered beyond recognition. That evening, when Grace finished the final cleaning tasks, Nate was still there, leaning comfortably against the counter beneath the warm, golden glow of the hanging lights. The sharp angles of his features were softened by the hue, making him look less imposing, more approachable. "I once thought staying would be the hardest thing I ever did," she said softly as she arranged the clean cups on the shelf. "But truly, the hardest part was believing I deserved peace in the first place." Nate stepped closer, not too close, but close enough that his quiet, grounded presence wrapped around her like a reliable shelter. "And do you believe it now?" Grace lifted her eyes to his, her gaze unwavering. "I am learning to," she admitted, "a little more every day." They stood there without touching, separated only by a few inches of counter space. Yet, between them was a promise woven out of enduring silence, a solid vow shaped by two people who had been violently shattered and still chose, every morning, to remain. They had found each other not because they were unbroken or perfect, but precisely because their fractures had made necessary space for profound understanding, for unwavering trust, and for a compelling reason to stay and build. They needed no noise, no legally binding words, only the simple, profound existence of each other. The late afternoon light drifted gently through the front windows of Liam's kitchen, washing the small cafe in a final, warm golden hue as Grace stood quietly behind the counter. Her gaze was softened by the sight of Sophia seated at the table near the window, carefully coloring a picture she had not yet finished. The lines were still unsteady, the shapes imperfectly formed, yet the drawing brimmed with undeniable life. A small house with a vibrant red roof, purple flowers blooming profusely along the porch, and three distinct figures standing hand in intertwined hand. On the wall directly behind Sophia hung a large, newly framed photograph, carefully placed as if actively guarding the sacred space of the room itself. It captured three people. Liam in his living years, with that shy, familiar smile and those smart, searching eyes. Isabel, radiant and gentle in her white dress, holding little Sophia when she was only 3. A photograph that stood as a poignant reminder, a quiet, enduring bridge between what had been lost forever and what had managed to endure. Grace looked at it and felt a quiet swell of emotion she could not quite name. The old, vicious pain no longer cut sharply as it once had. It had been softened, carefully tended to by days filled with true living rather than mere, desperate survival. She walked closer and sat down beside Sophia, asking softly, "What are you drawing, my sweetheart?" Sophia lifted her head, her bright eyes shimmering with innocent happiness. "It's our home. Mom, Grace, Dad, Nate, and me. This is our real castle." Grace smiled, resting her hand lightly on Sophia's soft hair. It was not a grand, architectural castle, but it was, profoundly, a home. Not perfect, messy sometimes, but safe enough for old, deep wounds to find the courage to finally heal. She glanced at the resilient child beside her, at the steadfast man who visited the cafe every single week without fail, and at the integrated photograph behind them. All the pieces that had once drifted agonizingly apart were slowly, miraculously finding their way back to each other, fitting together like necessary puzzle pieces. Grace felt a quiet, satisfying truth settled deep in her chest. This was not an ending. This was undeniably a powerful beginning. And this time, she was the one confidently writing the story. A story of love that did not need to be dazzling or loud to be intensely real. A slow, steady journey from devastating loss to profound rediscovery. A life rebuilt through earned trust and the simple, daily choice to keep going forward. This story belonged not just to Grace, but to anyone who had ever tasted deep grief, who had ever felt completely alone, who had ever believed the past had taken absolutely everything they held dear. Yet sometimes, in the darkest, most unexpected corners of life, something miraculous and fragile begins. A small, persistent light, a steady hand reaching out at precisely the right moment, a place that feels less like a destination and more like returning home. And if you are listening to this story now, perhaps you too are currently on the sacred path of rewriting your own. Thank you for staying with us until the final, tender moment of this heartfelt tale of healing and hope. If this story touched your heart, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it widely with those you love who might need to hear it. How does Grace and Sophia's journey resonate deeply with you personally? Have you ever stood at the difficult crossroads between immense loss and tentative hope? Leave a comment below and share with us the true, vulnerable feelings inside your heart. We deeply look forward to reading your thoughtful reflections, so we can continue bringing stories filled with humanity, raw emotion, and necessary healing to many more people who need them. We will see you in the next video, where every story is a mirror reflecting life and every character quietly carries a piece of who we are. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and many moments of genuine laughter and profound calm each and every day. Goodbye and see you in the next installment.